All right, let's get started. Hey everyone, I'm Ken Cerini. I'm managing partner of Cerini Associates. Hopefully everybody's doing well. And I have with me today Tania Quigley. Tania is a director in our nonprofit audit group. So thanks, Tania.
Welcome.
So we currently, as a firm, we currently work with 300 nonprofit organizations, and we're one of the top 10 firms working with nonprofits in the New York metropolitan area. I don't bring this up as a commercial for the firm. That's not the purpose of this. I just want to stress a point. As part of working with the nonprofit sector, we meet with a lot of audit committees during the year. And we do have some audit committees that totally get it. You know, audit committees who are open up an effective dialogue during the audit, before the audit, after the audit. They ask pertinent questions about the organization and its operations. They understand the industry related issues and concerns that the organization is going through. They're focused on risk, both internal risk and external risk, and they dedicate appropriate time to our meetings and discussions. Unfortunately, we have many more audit committees that we meet with that seem to take their lead from management or us as the auditors. And that's not really what the purpose of an audit committee is. And it's really, really important in terms of the overall control and governance of a public charity for the audit committee to be working effectively. We pride ourselves as a firm in adding value to relationships and feel that we have a responsibility to help educate the sector. Because after all, we don't know what we don't know, right? So as a result, what we've done is we've put together this boot camp, and this is going to be a series of 3 meetings that we're going to be doing. And really the purpose of this is to educate the nonprofit sector, to educate the audit committees out there so that they can make the process more meaningful and effective. Today, the purpose of today is really to do an overview of the audit committee. What are its responsibilities? Why is the audit committee important? Who should be on an audit committee? Those types of things. We'll also touch on some of the external and internal factors that we're going to get much, much deeper into our next 2 sessions. So today's session is really to lay the groundwork, and the next 2 sessions are going to be more in-depth. On October 7th, we'll do a more in-depth session on the committee's role in the audit process and external factors. And on November 4th, the focus will be more on the internal factors and kind of working with the internal staff and what you need to understand in terms of the internal operations of the organizations that you're on the audit committee of. So that's kind of how we've laid things out. Before we get started, I do want to, like I said, lay a little bit of foundation for you as to why the audit committee is so important. And I think the key factor there is public trust. So when you think about a publicly traded company, I know nonprofits are not necessarily publicly traded companies, but when you think about a publicly traded company that takes money from investors and utilizes that money as the equity base of the company, nonprofit organizations similarly rely upon the general public for their funding. So you've got funding that's coming from charitable contributions that are being made by the general public. You've got funding that's coming from government sources, right? Which is really the taxes that you and I pay each year. And those taxes are going to fund different aspects of nonprofit organizations. So the nonprofit organizations, a lot of nonprofit organizations are getting money from the general public. And it's important for the general public to feel comfortable about that their money is going to where it's supposed to be going. It's being utilized effectively to maximize the benefit of the organization provides to the community. The organization is following the intended purpose of the funds and its intended purpose as an organization. And the organization is managing risk appropriately. Again, and a lot of these places are where the audit committee comes into play. The use of an independent auditor, okay, within this process, you know, as independent auditors for, like I said, many nonprofit organizations, you know, we have a specific role. And really it's important for nonprofit organizations to kind of bring on an independent auditor who understands the nonprofit sector, excuse me, and equally importantly, the funding streams and operations of your particular nonprofit under the supervision and oversight of you guys, the audit committee. If you do that, it helps ensure that the public trust is being met. And remember, that's kind of one of the key factors here is that public trust. In order to, for the process to work, however, there needs to be several things. There needs to be an open dialogue. The audit committee needs to have the ability to understand and assess the effectiveness of the external auditor, needs to understand the internal risks that lie within the organization. Again, these are some of the key things, and we'll talk about these and more things as we move along today. Unfortunately, as I said before, way too often, the audit committee isn't really performing its role up to the level that it really should be. This is not a, once a year, twice a year sort of role. It should be really a year-round role. It's not a quick 20-minute meeting with the auditor so you can check off a box on the Form 990. It's really more of, like I said, an in-depth process that should be happening throughout the year. We'll go over today a sample of maybe what a quarterly meeting should look like and things like that. So we'll kind of cover you on all that. We're hoping that after you go through our audit committee boot camp, you'll have a much stronger understanding of your role, the questions you should be asking, the information you should be seeking, and how you can truly help your organization you serve protect itself and ensure that it's doing what it should be doing from a fiscal, operational, and compliance perspective. And those are three of the key things, again, we'll be going over the next 3 meetings that the audit committee has responsibility for. I think the fact that you guys are here today means that you're ready to become more effective audit committee members. I thank you for that. And again, it's important for the sector to make sure that organizations are getting it and are doing things right. As auditors, we enjoy the opportunity to work with audit committees collaboratively in an effort to mitigate risk and lessen the likelihood of non-compliance and frankly, government takebacks. A lot of times, if you're not doing what you should be doing, and the government comes in and does an audit, that could result in takebacks, and that's not what anybody wants to see or hear. So we want to stay proactive, and we want to really understand what's happening within the organization so we can prevent some of that. If anybody has any questions, there are 2 things on your bottom of your screen. You have a Q&A where you can kind of dive in and ask a question on the Q&A, or there's a little chat. You can ask a question on the chat. Please feel free to ask questions throughout. We'll try to get to as many of them as we possibly can as we're going through the presentation. Sorry for the long introduction. Again, I just wanted to set the stage as to where we're going. So let's dive into the material. Tanya, you want to kick it off?
Okay. So I'm going to start with the legal aspects of the audit committee. So the Nonprofit Revitalization Act of 2013 updated a lot of the laws that the new nonprofits in New York State are governed by. So one of the updates from this Revitalization Act was that an audit committee was to be required for nonprofits that are required to have a financial statement audit. And a financial statement audit is required once the organization's total revenue exceeds $750,000. The Nonprofit Revitalization Act also outlines a lot of other requirements and responsibilities that is expected of the audit committee, and that we will dive into in the next few slides also. The audit committee is a committee of the board. So as a committee of the board, it has the authority to operate on behalf of the board. It's made up of at least 3 independent board members. These independent board members have voting rights, so they can vote on matters that take place at the audit committee level. As far as being independent, they should be independent as far as to the organization and within each other. So there shouldn't be any spouses that are both on audit committees or any type of family member situations. So the audit committee can also have non-voting independent members. So if there's any type of individuals that have a certain expertise in an area that the audit committee is looking to have them come onto that committee, to help, give insight. They won't be a voting member, of course, but they still have to be independent. A difference in a committee, as far as being a board committee, there's also a committee of the organization. So the difference between the two is that the committee of the organization does not have the authority to act on behalf of the board. So it's important that the audit committee is a committee of the board. The organization's bylaws, that should include an audit committee as a standing committee. The bylaws can also incorporate other board committees, such as the finance committee, or make the audit committee the responsibility of the board. So usually if there's board members that are, if there's not a significant board, usually that audit committee role and function is consumed by the board, because there's not a significant board members that will take on that audit committee responsibility by itself. There's also an audit committee charter. So this audit committee charter, it outlines the responsibilities of the audit committee, and that should be reviewed and updated quarterly. It's very important that this charter should be considered to have for the organization, because it outlines a lot of the responsibilities. It kind of defines the audit committee in all their roles that they should be doing, you know, not just around the time of the financial statements, but also, you know, throughout the year, the different responsibilities that it has to take over, you know, throughout the year.
Tania, before you jump to the next slide, I want to kind of jump in on a couple of the things that you mentioned here. So Tania mentioned that from an audit perspective, the audit threshold is $750,000. That audit threshold for next year, 2021, is going to be jumping to $1 million under the Nonprofit Revitalization Act. So just something to keep in mind, that the threshold for the audit will be increasing from $750,000 to $1 million. Tania talked about the independent board members. And I just want to kind of spend a couple minutes making sure that we're on the same page in terms of what independence means with respect to you know, having the independent directors or independent board members as part of the audit committee. So what that means is that that the individual is not or has not been an employee or key person of the organization or any of its affiliates in the prior 3 years. So you got a 3-year window where you can't be an employee or a key person within the organization. The individual cannot have received $10,000 from the organization over that 3-year period. Now that doesn't include reimbursement for expenses and functioning as a board. That includes any level of compensation and stuff that's being received by that individual. That the independent director cannot have a relative who has been a key person or received $10,000 from the organization over the last 3 years. And I want to stress there, I said key person, I didn't say employee. You can have a relative who is an employee as long as they are not in a key role within the organization. So those are the three primary. In addition, there's one other. So you could have an individual, if all of the following 3 are met, they are not considered to be independent. So if they are an employee or substantial owner of a company that received or provided payments or services to the organization above the following thresholds. So again, we talked about being an employee or key person, but also if you are a vendor to the organization, or if you're providing services or receiving services from the organization, you could be precluded from serving on the audit committee as non-independent. And those 3 thresholds in terms of the dollar amounts that trigger that is if you're under $500,000, so if the organization is under $500,000 worth of revenue, the lesser of $10,000 or 2% of the entity's gross revenue. If it's between $500,000 and $10 million, the threshold is $25,000. And for an organization over $10 million, the threshold will be $100,000. So if you have an individual who serves on your board, who provides services, or has a family member who provide services to the organization and they're an officer of the company that provides the services, then you could be precluded from being independent if you cross any of those thresholds, 10K, 25K, or 100K. So again, I just want to make sure that everybody understands what that independent director means, because that's a very, very important consideration. And I think, again, part of all this, and we'll talk about it a little bit more, part of this is also understanding in terms of making sure that you have in place as an organization a well-documented conflict of interest process, so that you can really understand if any of these conflicts do exist with your board members. Because again, you could set up this audit committee, and if you have someone on the audit committee who is not independent and you only have a 3-person audit committee, you could really be in a situation where you really don't have the audit committee functioning the way it's supposed to. Tania also mentioned that you can have additional non-voting independent members to bring on additional expertise, which is definitely the case. The thing to keep in mind, though, is that members of management who are responsible for developing and maintaining financial controls cannot and should not be part of the audit committee in any way, even to the respect of being non-voting members, because they are not independent. And it's really important to be able to have good open dialogue and discussion regarding controls and stuff. So they really can't be part of that. If there are any, non-independent, so again, Tania also mentioned you could have the entire board as your audit committee. If any of those board members are not independent, those non-independent board members can't be involved in any of the deliberation or vote. So just because you decide to use your board doesn't now make everybody on your board eligible to be part of the audit committee. They still need to be independent in the process, which means then again, any of the people who aren't independent who sit on your board cannot be involved in the deliberation and vote. Tania?
And just to mention about the audit committee charter, it's very beneficial to have, because, you know, as board members or as members of the audit committee change, this charter will give them a clear understanding of what their, the tasks that they have to do, their responsibility, and what they're signing up for to carry on, you know, to be part of that audit committee. So it's great to have. Somebody
did ask a question whether the audit committee could be folded into the finance committee, so that you could have one committee, the finance committee, that functions as both a audit committee and a finance committee. Again, the answer is, as long as we're following the regulations where it is a committee of the board, it can't be a committee of the organization, as Tania mentioned earlier, so it must be a committee of the board. It must have at least 3 independent board members. The non-board members on the finance committee cannot be involved in votes and stuff. Then the answer would be yes, you could. You can incorporate it into another committee, finance committee, executive committee, whatever. You just have to make sure that at the end of the day, you're following the regulations. It's extremely important because as Tania mentioned, that the audit committee is specifically addressed and identified within the Nonprofit Revitalization Act, which is law, New York State law. So it's really, really important that the audit committee is done appropriately, because again, it is written into law. There aren't a lot of other committees that are written into law as the audit committee is. So it's very important. Sorry, Tania, go ahead.
So the purpose of the audit committee, generally when we think of the audit committee, we just assume they meet with the auditors, they review the financial statements, go through the audit process. But, you know, as Ken mentioned before, the role and the responsibilities of the audit committee goes far beyond that. And it's a year-round job that they have to carry out. The audit committee must evaluate risk within the organization, both internally and externally. You know, all organizations have some level of risk. and it's the audit committee's responsibility to make sure that they understand what those risks are, and that the organization has internal controls in place to address those risks, or possibly, to review it and modify if there's any changes to the risk. So some examples of internal risk can be if the organization takes on a new program, or if they receive a new source of funding. So federal funding could be new to an organization, and that comes with risk of making sure that the organization is compliant with how it's spending, that there's proper internal controls in place, financial reporting in place to comply with the government funding. That the programs, any new programs, are properly being carried out, and also in line with the organization's mission. So you don't want to take on programs that are kind of off the organization's main mission. There is also IT risk. So what is the risk that the organization is vulnerable to hackers? Making sure that there's not a high risk of loss of data. So making sure that the organization has the proper IT controls in place, and has, whether it outsources its IT or it has an IT employee in-house, that makes sure that the organization is properly protected with all of their data that they share. External risks could be that there's changes to any of the laws or regulations that the organization receives funding for. There could be changes in audit protocols that the organization should be aware of. So any changes in those audit protocols can make the organization vulnerable to possible compliance issues that may come out as a result of audit procedures. So the audit committee should understand, and evaluate the risks internally and externally for the organization, throughout the year, and make sure if there's any new risks that are being identified, that they're being managed, and have the internal controls in place to address those risks or update. So there's going to be a lot of communication between the audit committee and management to make sure that what the audit committee is identifying is being carried out by management. The other purpose of the audit committee, as we said before, is to select an independent certified public accountant, and that is, proper, certified enough to perform the audit of the organization's financial statements. They need to oversee the audit process from start to finish, and at the end, they review and approve the audited financial statements. In addition to your annual financial statement audit, certain organizations have a retirement plan, whether it's a 401k plan, 403b plan, or defined benefit plan, that is subject to an audit. That is another issued report that the audit committee should be taking responsibility for, to make sure it's accurate and is done properly.
Tania, I don't mean to cut you off there a second, but I can tell you we do probably about 40 pension audits, Tania?
Yeah, about. Mm-hmm.
And how many audit committees or boards do we actually meet with on pension plans?
2.
After we finish? 2.
2.
Yeah, I mean, again, that's something that there's a certain level of risk and stuff. The Department of Labor is looking at these pension plans on a regular basis. And again, it's rare that we get to speak to our audit committees regarding the pension audits and have a conversation with respect to some of the concerns and stuff that may exist. So again, something we definitely push in terms of the fact that, there is risk associated with these pension plans, and it is part of the audit process. So the audit committee should be getting involved in these pension audits. Sorry, go ahead.
Okay. Each year, if the auditor has any findings as a result of their financial statement audit, the audit committee should evaluate those findings, fully understand the findings, and put the proper, implementations in place to address those findings. The audit committee should include members that can take responsibility for the accuracy of the financial statements. So those 3 independent members, they should have some level of financial not expertise, but some level, basic financial statement understanding, to know that the financial statements presented to them by the auditors are in compliance with accounting principles generally accepted in the US, to fully see that they're being properly presented. There's also an understanding of the internal controls of the organization, and that they have to understand the audit process to know that the auditors are doing the processes that they're supposed to be doing. And then another note is that the internal audit function, not all nonprofits have an internal audit function, but those that do, there should be constant communication between the audit committee and the internal audit department. The audit committee should be monitoring the internal audit department, and they can also coordinate any certain kind of requests that the audit committee wants the internal audit department to carry out. So that's constant communication between those two departments is important.
On terms of that internal audit function, I mean, it's important that the internal auditors, if you do have internal audit function within your organization, is doing an annual risk assessment. And that annual risk assessment that gets performed goes back to the first bullet here that Tanya talked about, is evaluating risk within the organization. Because, you know, risk comes from both internal and external factors. As Tanya mentioned, risk comes from changes within the organization. So if there's turnover of staff, if there's new computer programs put in place, if there's new policies that are established by the board of directors, all of those create new avenues of risk that need to be considered. We're going to get a lot deeper into the selection of the independent certified public accountant in our second session. That's going to be coming up. Having said that, though, there are a couple things that I want to kind of touch on now. So when you are considering firms and deciding which firm to work with, a lot of times we see organizations, you know, look at things strictly from a price perspective, because I think at certain respects, you know, organizations look at audits as a commodity. And I'd like to think that an audit is not a commodity. Everybody's going to view the audit differently, and everybody's going to bring different things to the table with respect to the audit. I think it's really important to, when you're making that selection, to really develop a good scorecard in terms of how you're going to determine which firm you're going to use and determine the effectiveness of the firm you're currently using. You know, and that scorecard should look at things like the firm's reputation. It should look at references. It should look at specialization within your particular area of the nonprofit sector, because not all nonprofits are the same. There are different funding streams. Different funding streams have different ways that they pay, different regulations. So how familiar is the audit firm you're talking to with respect to you know, those different regulations? Obviously, fee structure is important for organizations. Staff continuity, how do we ensure that you know, you're going to get the same staff year after year? What are the expected timelines? Are you going to be able to meet deadlines? What are the deliverables? Are we just going to get an audit? Are there other deliverables that go with it? What other abilities or what other information can the auditors provide? What other benefits exist? Also, any audit firm that goes and does external audits is required to have a peer review, which means that every 3 years they have an outside accounting firm come in and look at the work that they do. As a audit committee, you should always be getting a copy of that peer review letter to be able to make an assessment as to whether the audit firm that you're working with is effective and doing an effective job. One other thing that Tanya mentioned, Tanya talked about the nonprofit financial statements and the role of the audit committee in terms of making sure that they understand and have a basic understanding of the financial statements. It's also important that not just the financial statements, but it's also important they have a basic understanding on how the organization is funded, what are the compliance issues with respect to the organization that they're working with, and what are the regulations out there. Because again, if you don't understand financial reporting, if you don't understand regulations and compliance issues, if you don't understand how an organization is funded, it's really hard for you to evaluate and assess risk. So, there is a bit of homework that comes into play with respect to being a audit committee member. So that's important. We do have another question out there. It's what should be the role of the compliance person in this process? So the compliance person, I assume you're talking about the internal compliance person. What I'm going to say is we'll get to that a little bit later today as we go through the presentation. Also, we'll be talking a lot more about that in our third presentation. So we will get that question answered if you just hold on a couple minutes. Tanya, back to you.
If the organization has a quality assurance or Medicaid compliance function, there should be regular meetings between those departments and the audit committee so they can discuss any concerns, risks, and findings. The Medicaid compliance functions, they do their own internal testing throughout the year, and it's important for the audit committee to be made aware of those findings. Or if other way around, if the audit committee wants the QA or the Medicaid compliance function to look into certain things, that should be something that needs to be communicated between the two. The audit committee should receive and consider any actions to recommend to the full board as a result of the audit recommendations that resulted from the financial statement audit. The audit committee should also handle any complaints about financial mismanagement. So nonprofits, for the most part, should have a whistleblower policy. The audit committee should be kind of made aware of any instances that caused the whistleblower or any matters that were brought to their attention. They need to make sure that it's being handled in a proper fashion and that it's being handled discreetly. So this to protect the whistleblower or whoever brought up the issue. They also should review other reports from governmental audits and funding sources. So if an organization is subject to uniform guidance, there's certain uniform guidance reports that are issued from the auditors, and the audit committee should have an understanding of what those reports are and what should be included within those reports, and to make sure that, as mentioned before, that the organization has the proper internal controls in place to manage those funding sources to be compliant.
I'll jump into a couple other quick things here. One of the things I think that's important, and one of the things I think that's pretty clear here, is that this is not, for the most part, your audit committee members' sole job. I mean, they have another job. They're doing this on a voluntary basis. There's a lot of information here, and that's why I think it's very, very important to ensure that there's good communication taking place across multiple levels. You have to have that good communication with management. You need to have that good communication with the auditors. That's why I think at times I sometimes get frustrated when we go and we meet with an audit committee and we're told we've got 20 minutes to present. 20 minutes, yeah, I can get through a presentation in 20 minutes, but we're really not diving into some of the risk and having that really open dialogue and discussion. I like to spend more time with my audit committees and have good open dialogue. A couple things to keep in mind. Again, the big purpose of the audit committee is to understand risk. And in order to understand risk, you need to do some level of evaluation of the organization. And then you need to look to see what management is doing to mitigate risk. So yes, there's risk, but then there needs to be that communication with management. And someone asked about, the compliance officer before. That's the compliance officer is looking at a lot of the different areas of risk. So if you're not, as an audit committee, meeting with the compliance officer, once or twice a year, to have a discussion and reviewing reports and getting training and everything else, then again, I think you're doing the organization and yourself a disservice. Tanya mentioned the Medicaid compliance function here. If your organization receives over $500,000 worth of Medicaid funding, you're required to have a Medicaid compliance function. And during that compliance function, if there is findings that where Medicaid was inappropriately billed, remember, you have an obligation to return that money to Medicaid and to self-report any errors. So again, it's very, very important to understand where the risks are. What are we doing from a risk perspective? Most of the funding streams that you're going to work with, whether it be OMH, whether it be OPWDD, whatever the funding stream happens to be, especially if it's a Medicaid funded funding stream, they have audit protocols on their websites. So it's fairly easy for both you as an audit committee member and the organization to download some of those audit protocols and go through those audit protocols to get comfortable. A couple other things that I think are important to note that the audit committee is responsible for, or should be responsible for, is if there are conflicts of interest, what are we doing in terms of monitoring the conflict of interests? So, the audit committee really should be monitoring conflicts of interest and ensuring that there's no risks that exist within the conflict of interest area. If there are legal matters that are out there, what is the audit committee doing in terms of understanding what the legal matters and how they're going to impact both the reputation and financial health of the organization? So what are we doing to mitigate risk? What are we doing to with respect to legal matters? Insurance is another area where there's risk. You have risk within the area of insurance. Are we adequately covered for insurance? Do we have proper coverage in place? Things like cybersecurity coverage, D&O coverage, malpractice coverage, are all of those things properly set up and at the right thresholds and limits that we should have? Insurance companies have what's known as loss experience runs. Those loss experience runs provide a detail of all of the claims and projected claims that the insurance company is going to have to pay out. It might make sense for the audit committee to be reviewing those loss experience runs on an annual basis to see what sort of potential exposure or risk might exist. There's something called the Justice Center for anybody who's providing services to individuals under certain funding sources. And if someone gets injured within a facility or there are issues like that, those have to be reported to the Justice Center. Well, it's important to see what sort of reporting is happening to the Justice Center, because if I have, let's say, a community center or a group home, and people are getting injured on a regular basis, that might be telling me from a risk perspective that I need to do a better job of updating my facility, because there might be problems within my facility that's adding to my risk. So again, those are some other areas. Every organization, depending on how it operates, depending on its funding streams, depending on all of those factors, every organization is going to have different risks. And it's really going to be important for each organization to take the time to understand the risks and what's out there. We do have another question. Can a board treasurer and executive director be on the audit committee in addition to 3 independent audit committee members? The answer to that is the board treasurer can be, as long as they are independent. The executive director should not be. The executive director could go and provide information and insight, but the executive director should not be on the audit committee because, again, all audit committee members, whether they are community members or board members, should be independent, and an executive director clearly is not independent of the organization. So the executive director, again, can be part of the process, but the executive director should not be a standing member of the audit committee. Anything else you want to add there, Tanya?
No, I think I'm good.
Okay. Responsibilities of the audit committee. So as we mentioned already, and I'm not going to get too deep into this, the audit committee is responsible for selecting a qualified independent certified public accountant to perform the financial statement audit. So that includes sending out a request for proposal to several CPA firms. There's a lot of good RFPs that you can download online. Again, you want to make sure that when you create your RFP for your CPA firm, that goes hand in hand with your evaluation form. So you really should create an evaluation form as to what the key factors you're going to be looking for, and make sure that the RFP and the evaluation form are in sync. You're also responsible for evaluating the effectiveness of the firm performing the audit. If I'm a firm believer in that. You hire an accounting firm. Every so many years, you should go out to bid to keep the firm honest and make sure that you can get a good idea of what else is out there in the marketplace. But you should change your accounting firm when your accounting firm ceases to be a resource to your organization, ceases to be provide value in the relationship. And whether that's 1 year, 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, I'm not a big believer in turnover for turnover's sake. I think you really should be turning over your CPA firm when that firm is no longer the right fit for your organization. One of the other things that we see all the time is that the Nonprofit Revitalization Act of 2013, which was then updated in 2017, basically came out and said that if an organization has over $1 million worth of total annual revenue, the audit committee should be meeting with the auditors not just after the audit to go over the audit results, but before the audit also to review planning. So you have a pre-audit meeting, includes things like a discussion of the audit process, the risks that exist within the organization, reviewing of independence issues, what's the extent and timing of the audit, what are the roles of the auditor versus roles of management, those types of things. Again, it's another one of those areas where we don't see those meetings happening on a regular basis. And that's something that really is supposed to happen. It's written into the Nonprofit Revitalization Act, which is a law. So it is important to make sure that that is being addressed. Another responsibility is to review and approve the results of the audit. So there are several documents that come out of an audit. And again, we'll get a little deeper into that on the October 7th presentation we do, but you have your audited financial statements, and those audited financial statements could be standalone, they could be consolidated or combined, you could have a uniform guidance component to it. You could have a management letter which identifies material weaknesses or significant deficiencies within the internal controls of the organization. There could be certain restrictions on the scope of the auditor's activities. That happens a lot in pension plan audits, where the DOL allows, Department of Labor allows for the audit to exclude the audit of investments, and those are certified directly by the plan custodian. There should be what's known as a SAS 114 letter, which is certain required communications with management, which goes over a myriad of things, such as changes in any policies that exist, significant disclosures, estimates, material adjustments, past adjustments, disagreements with management, opinion shopping type things. So those are all things that, you should be having that conversation with your external auditors and as part of that review process. Once the financial statements are approved, again, as a committee of the board, the audit committee does have the ability to approve the financial statements. It really comes down to what your internal practice is. So either the audit committee can approve, or the audit committee can gather all the information, then report back to the board, and the board ultimately approves. But either way, it's up to the audit committee to decide what information it wants to take from that meeting and share with the board. And in addition, there's another document, the Form 990, and which is the tax return that organizations file. It really, again, falls under the auspices of the audit committee to review that 990 and make sure that that 990 tells the story appropriately and that it's in compliance with IRS regulations. Anything you want to add there, Tanya?
No, I'm good.
Okay, next slide. Oh, wait, I think we have another question. Please clarify how staff members who are invited to the audit committee to present and to engage in discussion versus the ability to have those discussions in an open and frank manner. Organizations often bring people to audit committee meetings. I think it's important that you do have individuals coming, and we'll discuss that in the next section in terms of who should be coming to and what sort of discussion should be taking place. Yes, it's important to have members of management. It's important to have outside people coming to the audit committee meetings to address the audit committee and to help inform and provide information. What I had said earlier was that the audit committee, that these individuals should not be standing members of the audit committee. It doesn't mean that they can't come to the audit committee on a regular basis and present. They just can't be part of the audit committee. So I think that's the differentiating factor there, and hopefully that answered the question. So one of the things I wanted to go over a little bit was some of the sample audit, what a sample audit committee schedule could look like. Now, I'm a firm believer that the audit committee should meet at least quarterly. Anything less than quarterly, I think, is probably not appropriate. You can meet more often than quarterly, depending on how large the organization is, depending on whether you have an internal audit function, whether you have other things going on within the organization. So I think, that's all going to come into play in terms of how often the audit committee meets. But I think at a minimum, the audit committee should be meeting on a quarterly basis. Now, the way I laid this out, I laid it out showing third, fourth, then first and second quarters. I did that for a reason, not because we kind of function, we only start the audit committee in the third quarter. It's because the third quarter is roughly about when you should be reviewing and approving the audit firm selection. So that's really, since that is a primary role of the audit committee, is to make sure that that audit firm is in place. I really wanted to start with that as one of the key functions that's here. So you want to make sure that you go through the process of going out to bid so that you have plenty of time to be able to effectively evaluate, to effectively make the change. The auditors have a lot of work if you decide to move to a new audit firm. They have planning, they have to understand the systems of internal controls, they have to pull documentation, they have to get out confirmation. So there's a lot of things that have to happen. So the sooner you go through that process, the better. So if you are a December 31st year-end nonprofit organization, it's this quarter, September, October. Do I have that right?
October, November, December.
No, so it's the quarter before. Yeah, July, August, September. Thank you. That you should be thinking about the change to new auditors or evaluating whether you're going to keep the existing firm or whatever. That should be happening in the quarter that we're currently in that ends the end of September. If you're a December 31st year end, because theoretically you've already gotten your December 31st year end financial statements done. The auditors have finished off the audit, and now you're kind of moving into the cycle about thinking about next year from an audit perspective. If you have a compliance officer, if you have Medicaid compliance, the board should be going through annual training. And every time a new board member comes onto the board, there should be training taking place. So the third quarter is a great time for that compliance training to be taking place if you have Medicaid or other compliance issues that you need to go through. And again, the board should be going through the training just like your staff should. If you have an internal audit function, you should be meeting with the internal auditors to discuss results of quarterly testing. So what happened this quarter? What did you test? What were the findings? What were the findings last quarter, and what has management done in terms of a corrective action plan, and have you retested it? If there's a pension audit, now's about the time. Third quarter, beginning of the fourth quarter is where you're going to be meeting with your external auditor regarding your pension audit and making sure that the pension doesn't have any compliance issues, and discussing with your pension auditors any issues that may have arisen during the course of their audit. Fourth quarter, that's when you should be having your pre-audit meeting with the external auditors. That should either be happening in the fourth quarter or the first quarter, depending on the timing of your audit. So if your audit typically takes place, during the first quarter of your year, then you want to really have this pre-audit meeting in the fourth quarter of the previous year. If the audit takes place typically in your second quarter, you can push off that pre-audit meeting to the first quarter. But typically, I like to see that pre-audit meeting happening in the fourth quarter of the year. There should be a discussion of any new audit regulations that are going to be going into effect for your new year, any new audit pronouncements that are taking place, what's happening from a regulatory perspective, and what new regulations are going in from your regulatory and funding bodies, what new funding sources. Tanya mentioned earlier that's a potential risk. So it's all of these factors are things that you should be discussing at the fourth quarter. What security risks exist? And Tanya mentioned information system. Do you have any concerns regarding hacking? What sort of training is your staff going through to make sure that they don't open your organization up to additional risk in terms of making it easier for hackers to get into your system? When was the last time you updated some of the software? It might make sense to bring your IT people in and have a conversation with your IT staff to find out what they're doing from a risk perspective. What sort of data intrusion testing have they done, and things like that. Also, again, you should be meeting with your internal auditors every meeting. So if you're meeting 6 times a year, you'd be meeting with your internal auditors 6 times a year. If you're meeting quarterly, it's each quarter meeting with the internal auditors to go over. And fourth quarter, depending on when your insurance renews, fourth quarter might be a good time. If your insurance renews in your first quarter, that might be a good time to be reviewing your insurance and looking at loss experience runs and really understanding what the risks exist within insurance. So that would be a good time to do it. Tanya? First quarter of the year, again, you should be meeting with your internal auditor to discuss your annual risk assessment. That risk assessment is something that should be done once a year. So your internal auditor is either going to be doing a full-blown risk assessment, or they're going to be updating the risk assessment. But that risk assessment is happening annually, and there should be a discussion with respect to that risk assessment. You should be meeting with your compliance officer and QA function to discuss what they're finding, what risks exist. What sort of testing are they doing? So again, somebody had asked the question about meeting with compliance officers. I think it's very important that you as an audit committee are meeting with the compliance officer on a regular basis, at least twice a year, once for some level of training and once for an update as to what's going on from a risk perspective and what approach are they taking and what findings are they having. And again, as part of this, you can have a discussion of organizational risk and internal controls. What do we need to do to strengthen the internal control environment? What are we doing from what new organizational risks are coming into play from internal or external factors? And then the second quarter of the year is where, again, you would meet with your external auditors regarding the results of the audit. You would discuss any audit findings that come up. You'd review the 990. You'd have a discussion of maybe operational matters. And again, you can kind of move these pieces around. I'm just trying to get them kind of fit into some place to be able to discuss them. And then again, quarterly, you're meeting with your internal auditors. Again, we talked earlier about Justice Center reporting. We talked about review of insurance coverage. We talked about legal matters. We talked about a bunch of other things. Those would get fit into here where appropriate. Even things like, each year in the fourth quarter, first quarters, maybe when you want to make sure that conflict of interest statements, annual conflict of interest statements have been sent out to your employees and board members. And you might want to evaluate or have management put together a schedule so you can evaluate what sort of risks exist with respect to conflicts. So again, those are all things that kind of come into play here. Somebody asked a question, what do I mean with respect to compliance training? If you receive Medicaid funding over $500,000, you are required to go through and there's a whole series of training that you're required to do with respect to your organization. And that's training with respect to certain volunteers, training with respect to staff, board members, and the like. And that has to goes back to some of the whistleblowing that Tanya mentioned before. You got to educate your staff on basically it's the if you see something, say something sort of thing. So if you're running across any problems, or if they see that something is being inappropriately billed, or that services aren't being delivered appropriately, or that people are cutting corners, or any of those things, because you're required to provide the highest level of service, those are all things that need to be reported back to your compliance officer. So it's really important for your compliance officer to go out and to talk to your staff and talk to your board members, so that the board members and the staff really understand what the requirements are for your organization and what they should do if they have an issue or run across a problem, or where they report, how do they report anonymously, and those types of things. So that's what I mean by compliance training. Go ahead, Tanya, next slide. Just a couple other key points that I want to bring up. You must maintain minutes of the audit committee meeting, because those serve as support for the discussions and decisions that were made. Remember, this is a committee of the board. So the board can be bound by the organization. So it's important to make sure that there's proper minutes. Remember, because there's decision-making process taking place, you got to make sure that you understand what a quorum is, and that you have a quorum in place in order to bind the organization. The audit committee chairman, who's quite often the treasurer, should report back to the board the results of the audit committee. So those are all things that just kind of some loose ends that we want to make sure that we discussed as part of this. Let me see if we have any other questions. How can the audit committee adequately assess risk without an internal audit function? You don't necessarily need an internal audit function to assess risk. Risk is something that every organization has. And risk comes from different places. I mean, risk comes from, like I said, internal factors. Are your staff competent to be able to provide the services? Do you have adequate levels of staffing? Is there proper communication happening within the organization? Is there proper documentation? Do people understand what the regulations are with respect to the funding streams? All of those are internal risks. External risks, you've got lawsuits, you've got the external auditors and what the external auditors are finding from a control environment. So, I mean, it really comes down to the organization or the audit committee understanding how the organization operates. And that understanding comes from discussion with management, discussion with the, external auditors. It can come from attending seminars like this, where you gain a better understanding. It could come from attending trade association meetings and trade association seminars, so you get a deeper understanding of how your organization should be operating, what the key factors are within the organization, what those regulations are, so that you have a broad enough spectrum of information to be able to make decisions as to where risk lies. And again, risk changes each year based on factors. I mean, look at this year. This year with the COVID pandemic, this has created a whole new level of risks. anybody who's providing services and now can't provide services on a face-to-face basis and are providing services on a remote basis, are we following the regulations and everything that have been put in place under this new remote delivery system that we're supposed to have in place? So risk changes on a regular basis, and that's why it's important to be assessing risk annually. I don't know, can you switch to the next slide? I don't see any other questions. If anybody has any other questions, obviously feel free to shoot them out. We'll stay on for a couple extra minutes, but we want to thank you for your time. Hopefully you got something out of this and you understand a little bit more what your roles and responsibilities as an audit committee member are. I do want to invite you back on October 7th for our next installment of the Audit Committee Bootcamp, where again, we're going to be talking about the committee's role in the audit process. Hopefully you guys will be back on the 7th, and we'll see you then. I think we might have one more. Oh, no, just a thanks. So thank you, everybody. We appreciate your time, and this was great. Take care.
Thank you, everyone.